Good afternoon, everyone. I am Deirdre Cooper Owens, the Director of the Program in African American History at the Library Company of Philadelphia, and I would like to welcome each of you in attendance to celebrate our 2022 Black History Month programming. We are always excited about this month in particular because we are privileging as unapologetically as we can the importance of early African American history. Tonight, you're going to hear from two powerfully brilliant speakers and scholars and activists in their own right. Dr. William Thomas, who is a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Mélisande Short-Colomb, who is an activist and student and educator at Georgetown University. Both of them are descendants of people who owned slaves and who were slaves, or enslaved people, as we say now. And so it really brings to the fore the really important question of finding one's roots. But once you find out about those roots, what do we do with that information? How do we tackle persistent and thorny and contentious issues and questions around issues of equity and inclusion and fairness? And what does reconciliation look like? And so you'll be in, you will be in for hopefully a transformative moment. Dr. Thomas is a departmental mentor and colleague of mine. If you all want to blame him for taking me from the East Coast, you can do so, because he was really influential. And Ms. Short-Colomb doesn't know this. I have a history with Georgetown University. My mother worked for the hospital when I was in elementary school and junior high school. And so I essentially kind of sort of grew up on the campus. And so it is absolutely touching for me to see the ways that she is shaking up business as usual. She's institution building on an institution that was literally built on the backs of her ancestors. And so I would love for you to support them. We will be putting links where you can buy books, where you can see them speak. Ms. Short-Colomb has a wonderful TEDx talk at Georgetown that you should be able to Google and learn a bit more. And so we're going to follow a traditional program at first. You're going to hear from Dr. Thomas's multiple award-winning book, A Question of Freedom. And once he presents insights and discoveries from that book, then Will and Meli, as she is called, will be in conversation. So without further ado, I am going to pass it on to Jasmine Smith, the Assistant Director of the Program in African American History, who will bring you formal introductions. But also, I'd like to say thank you on behalf of Michael Bersanti, who is the director of this August institution, the Library Company of Philadelphia, who has always been such a staunch supporter of all of the programming that we do, and also Blanche Brown, who is behind the scenes working our tech. This is not a one-person operation. It is truly built on collaborative efforts. And lastly, thank you for joining us, for supporting us. Once you submit questions, please do so through the Q&A feature. I know that they are going to be coming in after both of their presentations and their discussion. Have a great night. I'm so sorry I'm unable to join you because I am giving a Black History Month talk myself. And if that were not the case, I would be there with you. So goodbye, enjoy the program, and thank you again for your support. The next voice you hear will be Jasmine Smith.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jasmine Smith, and I will be hosting tonight's event. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers, a few housekeeping notes. Tonight's event is being recorded, and a recording will be distributed to all attendees. We encourage all attendees to post questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. You may also post questions and comments in the chat. We will be posting additional information in the chat throughout the event, including instructions for how to turn on closed captionings should you need it. If you should run into any technical difficulties, please message the host and panelist window through the chat, and a staff person will be there to support you. Now that the technical details have been handled, I can introduce you to William G. Thomas III, who is the Engel Chair in the Humanities and Professors of History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Most recently, he is serving as the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Education from UNL's College of Arts and Sciences. He was co-founder and director of the Virginia Center for Digital History at the University of Virginia and is one of the country's leading digital humanities scholars. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Lincoln Prize finalist. He is the author of A Question of Freedom, The Families Who Challenged Slavery from the Nation's Founding to the Civil War, about enslaved families in Maryland who sued for their freedom in the decades after the American Revolution. A Question of Freedom received the 2021 Mark Lynton History Prize from the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize administered by the Newman Foundation for Journalism and the Columbia University School of Journalism. The History Book Prize is for the publication of a history text on any subject that best combines intellectual or scholarly distinction with happiness of expression. With partners Michael Burton and Wakitha Dreyer, he is co-producing a series of live-action animated documentary films. The first of these films, Anna, was released in 2018 and won Best Animation of New Media Film Festival in Los Angeles. The second, The Bell Affair, is in productions with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our other speaker for the evening is Mélisande Short-Colomb, a descendant of the Mahogany and Queen families, enslaved and then sold by the Society of Jesus in 1838 to ensure Georgetown sovereignty. Ms. Short-Colomb began her relationship with Georgetown University in 2017, when at age 63, she entered the College of Arts and Sciences as a freshman. From the start, Meli found her Georgetown home and the Laboratory of Global Performances and Politics, where she now works as a community engagement associate. Meli has written and performed the one-person play Here I Am under the direction of lab co-director Derek Goldman and backed by 8-person artistic team. Here I Am weaves together narrative, music, imagery, inviting the audience to an experimental journey exploring Colomb's loving and complicated relationship with the institution that enslaved her ancestors. Interrogating uncomfortable truths rather than offering easy answers. Here I Am challenges participants to bear witness and to reckon with their own histories and to imagine the future of racial justice in America. Meli serves on the Board of Advisors for the Georgetown Memory Project, the SSRC GU 272 Selection Committee, is a founding council member of the GU 272 Descendants Association, and was on the GU 272 advocacy team. She was a leading voice in the student referendum that on the $27.20 reconciliation fee, which passed with overwhelming student support on April 11, 2019. She received the 2019 Father Bunn Award for Journalistic Excellence for the commentary and support of the GU 272 referendum to create a new legacy. Meli is frequently invited to speak about the GU 272 and reparations, and her story has been widely covered in the media. Her talks vary from testimony before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to speaking at the Brooklyn Historical Society to a TED Talk. Meli has been featured in print outlets from the Washington Post, the New Yorker, to the AARP Journal. News programs on all the major outlets have had stories on Meli, and she starred in a Full Frontal with Samantha Bee's episode on reparations. A native of New Orleans, Louisiana, Mélisande retired from a lengthy culinary career, most recently as the chef instructor for Lango's Culinary Crossroads, to relocate to Washington to attend Georgetown University. Her family includes 4 adult children and much-loved grandchildren, and scores of newly identified GU 272 extended family members. We are happy to have Dr. Thomas serve as our Black History Month speaker along with Ms. Colomb Short. Please put your virtual hands together as Dr. Thomas begins the evening with the short presentation on A Question of Freedom, the families who challenged slavery from the nation's founding to the Civil War.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here tonight and to be with you. Thanks to the Library Company of Philadelphia for inviting us to be with you tonight and to talk about this important subject. Mélisande and I talked ahead about how we would begin this conversation, and we're going to take turns talking a little bit about the book, about the importance of this history, about reckoning with the history of slavery in this country, about how Meli and I met and what that meeting has meant to both of us, and about reconciliation broadly. This is meant to be a conversation, and conversation between us. So even in a webinar format, we invite you into this conversation. We invite you to make your thoughts known, your questions, ask your questions, and to put those in the chat as we go along so we can have this conversation together. I've been asked to start briefly with an overview of what the book is about and how I got into this story and where I started with this and what the main point of it is. And I want to say that I began this work 10 years ago, and it has been quite a journey, a personal journey. I've met so many people, including Mélisande, along the way, and it has been a journey of reckoning and a journey of history, and all of that is wrapped up in and in the book, A Question of Freedom. I started out researching a singular Supreme Court case. I had stumbled upon a reference to Queen v. Hepburn, a case brought by an enslaved woman, and it was a suit for her freedom. And it went to the United States Supreme Court in 1813. And when I first saw this reference to Queen v. Hepburn, I didn't know much about freedom suits. I certainly didn't know that there were freedom suits that early in American history. And it was a surprise to me to see this case in 1813 come before the United States Supreme Court and to see an enslaved woman suing a slaveholder for freedom. It was also a surprise because Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, was the lawyer for the Queen family and argued the case before the United States Supreme Court on behalf of the Queens. And I was curious about this Supreme Court case. It of course, was decades before the Dred Scott decision. That was really the only freedom suit that I knew much about, the Dred Scott case in 1857, right before the American Civil War, the notorious, infamous case in American history, in which the Supreme Court effectively rendered a decision that allowed slaveholders to take enslaved people anywhere in the United States effectively. It seemed to suggest, the Dred Scott case on the eve of the Civil War, that slavery was national, that slavery was sanctioned by the Constitution so powerfully that it would be able to be in any state. So I started looking into the Queen versus Hepburn freedom suit. I went to the National Archives and I pulled the record from the Supreme Court case. And it turns out that that case was brought before the DC court earlier, and I went and tracked that down. And the archivist handed me a 3-ring binder with an index of all cases brought to the DC court where an African American was involved in them. And there were a list of all of the Queen cases. One of them, filed at the very same moment as Mina Queen's against John Hepburn, was that of Priscilla Queen against the Reverend Francis Neal. I did not know at that moment that Francis Neal was the president of Georgetown College. And the more I dug into this case and saw that not only was there what I thought was one freedom suit by Mina Queen against John Hepburn, was really 5 freedom suits by the Queen family just in the DC court. And then I saw hundreds of other freedom suits by enslaved families suing slaveholders for freedom. And I thought that this was a terribly important story, that enslaved families had challenged slavery through the law, had challenged slaveholders personally in court, suing them for freedom in Washington, DC. And when I looked deeper into the Queen case, I found that all of the cases in Washington, DC followed a whole series of cases earlier in Prince George's County, Maryland. And that the Queen family and others, the Mahoney family, had sued Jesuit priests who held them as slaves. And these were some of the most important freedom suits in American history. These families sued slaveholders from day one of the United States, from the nation's founding. And as I pulled the threads of the Queen freedom suits, I was trying to follow their history back in time, because the central claim they made was that their ancestor, a woman named Mary Queen, had set foot in London and therefore was a free woman. And so, suing in Maryland, testimony had been allowed in court that proved this. That testimony was disallowed by the Supreme Court in 1813. And it was rendered hearsay and set aside. And that case, Queen v. Hepburn, was so centrally important in the Supreme Court's slow pathway toward Dred Scott. And so I wanted to tell the story of these freedom suits and how significant they were. And gradually, as I worked on this story, I found that one branch of my family, who I knew was from Prince George's County and who I knew had been slaveholders and lawyers and judges, were more closely connected to this story than I ever imagined or realized. And as I worked to trace pull the thread of this Queen case back in time to its origins and forward to those affected by it up to today, that led me to my meeting with Mélisande Short-Colomb. And I went to New Orleans to meet Mélisande, and we met at the public library to talk about this history. I wanted to know from her, as a descendant of the Queen family, what her family had experienced. And I will say that that was the moment that I realized that the story I was telling was not solely a story of history. It was a story of reckoning, a story of reconciliation, a story today, and it needed to be told in relation to today. It's a felt history, and 240 years ago, as Sandra Green Thomas, one of the other descendants who was there that day, said, is the blink of an eye. Now, I did not know how I would do it. I did not know how this book would come together, but in that moment, I felt the story needed to be told with and through descendants, and that their voices needed to be in the book, and indeed, not just in the prologue or not just in an epilogue, but throughout this book, the voice of the descendants needed to be heard. And so, Mélisande, over to you.
Thank you, Will, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. Um, when I met Will, I was brought into this history because I was alerted to my connection to families who had been sold by the Jesuits in 1838. Will had been writing his book and doing his research, and our paths crossed because in the middle of Will's research, here comes this big story about families who were trafficked by the Jesuits, who had been enslaved by the Jesuits and Catholic families. And those families were related to the very families that Will was researching for his book. So in my family, when Will and I met, we met at the public library. There was a small group of descendants in New Orleans and the surrounding area who had come together to build a little coalition of descendants. We were the first ones to find out about this history. And Will wanted to talk to us about what we knew from our families, what you heard. Did anybody talk about anything? And as we told our stories around the table of what we'd heard from grandparents and family members, I related a 300-year-old family history that Will was doing the active research on. And that story lasted in my family through enslavement by the Jesuits, being trafficked by the Jesuits, being enslaved in Louisiana. 314 family members were sold to Louisiana. And at the end of the Civil War, 96 people were alive from that sale. And those were the family members that the first and second generation of newly freed Black people in America would know. So my great-grandmother and my grandmother were brought into the world by the hands of their grandmothers and great aunts who had been young people sold to Louisiana in 1838. And the stories that those generations of children heard from their grandparents and great aunts and cousins was of a life in another place called Maryland. And they told about the freedom suits. They talked about Francis Scott Key, and they knew this story and passed it down and passed this history to their children in Louisiana, because they were living in community with these individuals and were members of their families when these suits were going on. So everybody knew about them. All of the enslavers in Maryland knew about these suits, and most of the enslaved people in Maryland and Virginia knew about these suits because it was common knowledge in the general population. So here I have a story that I got from the time I was born about these incredible people who had been born in Maryland and transported to Louisiana and they were free people. Because my grandmother and my great-grandmother and those family members did not tell slavery stories. They told freedom stories. And that day, when I talked to Will, I had the remnant of the history of my family that goes back to 1688 and 1715, when my grandmothers arrived here in the Maryland colony and there was no slavery. Slavery was created on their backs and in their wombs. So here we are to talk about it. And since I met Will, I came to Georgetown, I engaged with the university. It has been an incredible opportunity, and I have wonderful relationships, and we are embarking on including people who were left out of the narratives of creating freedom in America, because free people didn't have to fight for freedom. Free people were free. So if you think about it, who were the people who were most invested in freedom in America, if not those people that it was kept from? And it was kept from those people through laws and policies. And that's why we're here today talking about it.
Yeah, this story of freedom making is so important because, in part, it's one that shows the instability of slavery in the law. For example, I did not really realize when I began this work just how dubious in the law slavery was, and enslaved families challenged the legality of slavery through these freedom suits. And gradually, I began to think of these freedom suits as a kind of public underground railroad, right? Because families, if they won a freedom suit, could then use that court victory to win freedom suits for many others. And that's exactly what happened in the case of the Queens. In Prince George's County, back in the 1790s, they succeeded in winning freedom suit after freedom suit. And so did some other families. And so hundreds of family members gained their freedom through the courts in this way. And these were dramatic suits. They were held in the general court, which met in the State House in Annapolis. So the State House chamber included the general court, and the public saw these freedom suits, saw these claims of universal liberty, saw the arguments that were being made on to consider slavery unlawful, unconstitutional, a violation of natural law. All of those arguments were repeated in the courts, and enslaved families made them again and again and again. And so these families passed this knowledge down, not only through the generations, but across to other families in Maryland. And so these freedom suits were family-based, they were intergenerational, they happened from day one in the United States and before in the colonial period. And I think one of the things that became so important in this story were the seeing these families and individuals in as political and legal actors, right? They are in this society fully dimensional. They're not one-dimensional. And in this book, I try to name everyone.
Mhm.
You know, to name every Queen family member who won their freedom, to name everyone by their complete names. This is slavery was not nameless and faceless. It was in fact the enslavement of particular families, like the Queens and the Mahonies.
Right, and these families went back a long, long time. Before 18, we have the first suit from Edward Queen in 1791.
Right, yeah.
In 1773, we have Anne Joyce's grandsons murdering a man, trying to make them be enslaved. It didn't work out well for them either.
Right.
But the ongoing story in the family that could be documented through deposition went all the way back to the founding families of Maryland. And the other thing that happened, and I'm reading the book very closely, is that the freedom suits also shamed other families into manumitting people they were enslaved, because slavery wasn't a good look for some people. So that's another thing that happens. And why don't we as Americans know about these things? Why isn't it taught in law school? Why is Dred Scott the most oppressive lawsuit that pushed Black people even further down into slavery? Is our dominant narrative in the courts, when 100 years before that, the courts were popping with enslaved people saying, no, what you're doing is not right. I have rights. I am a human being.
Melisande, one of the people who I write about is an ancestor of yours, Charles Mahoney.
Mm-hmm.
And Charles Mahoney is a person that I just feel should be taught in every American history class, because this is a man who sued for his freedom and his family's freedom in 1791, and the case took 12 years. There were 3 jury trials and 2 appeals in Maryland. And at one point, Charles Mahoney wins the jury trial. He is declared a free man.
Charles
And
Mahoney is a free man.
Charles Mahoney is a free man, is the verdict of the jury and the court. And the Jesuits who enslaved Charles and his family at White Marsh in Prince George's County, Maryland, the Jesuits appeal to the Maryland higher court, the appellate court, and they get that verdict overturned. And then there's another trial. And gradually through these appeals, this litigation drags on, and the evidence is turned against Charles Mahoney, and he is enslaved continued to be enslaved. The court does not rule in his favor eventually. It takes 12 years.
Mhm.
He is present at all of the depositions. We don't have the words of Charles Mahoney, but we have his actions, and we have his physical presence at every one of these depositions. And he carries this case forward.
Mhm.
These cases weren't brought by attorneys.
No.
These cases, and this is another thing that I really gradually came to realize, these cases are not just singular idiosyncratic events. These freedom suits were all part of one story challenging slavery through the law. And Charles Mahoney is leading these freedom suits at a particular point in time in Maryland. The lawyers are not creating these. The enslaved families are creating these freedom suits. They're driving these freedom suits. They're bringing them. And Charles Mahoney carries this suit on for 12 years. He eventually really negotiates or forces the Jesuits to manumit him, as you were just saying. And he moves to Washington, D.C. And 12 years later, he has saved enough money to buy the freedom of his daughter, who remained enslaved. So here's a person who spent 25 years suing for freedom and purchasing his daughter's freedom. And, you know, the courage, the determination, the knowledge, and the love that he speaks about for his daughter in her freedom papers. He manumits her upon, as soon as he's able to purchase her, he manumits her, right? That story of Charles Mahoney is central to the book, and I think it's a central one in American history. We need more stories like this. We know about Frederick Douglass, we know about Harriet Tubman, but we need to know more about, and our schools need to teach the history of slavery in personal terms, in particular terms, with Charles Mahoney and your family and their history.
Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman knew about the Queens and the Mahonies.
Oh, sure. Yes.
In Maryland.
Assuredly. The Queen family at one point was the largest free Black family in Maryland, right, in 1840, 45. Frederick Douglass certainly knew about the Queen family and knew about and would have known about the freedom suits.
Right. And the Queens and the Mahonies, who were still enslaved by the Jesuits at the time, right, of the sale, their families were actively working to purchase their freedom. Everybody knew, it wasn't a secret. Yeah. So what the Jesuits did in 1838 was to take the Queen family members and the Mahoney family members that they still had some hold to, and sell them and ship them to Louisiana, right, where Abraham Mahoney and Mary Ellen Queen met on the voyage to Louisiana. And here I am.
Yeah, right. Yeah. For our audience, I think the reason that the Jesuits were able to and did sell more than 200 men, women, and children in 1838 was they had previously defeated the freedom suits that had been challenging them for decades. So the Queen v. Hepburn Supreme Court decision was really the important moment, because at that moment, no other freedom suits could go forward against the Jesuits because they were based on ancestry, and that form of evidence, that secondhand testimony, those depositions were rendered by the Supreme Court inadmissible. So the court had sort of shut down the freedom suits that the Queens and the Mahonies had brought for decades. And it's at that moment that the Queens, the Mahonies, and others enslaved by the Jesuits remained in slavery until the Civil War.
And folks knew one another.
Yes.
You know, the Jesuits knew the Queens and the Mahonies, and the Queens and Mahonies knew the Jesuits and the Catholic families, because they had been here since the start together.
Let's talk briefly and open it up to questions from the audience, but let's talk briefly, Mélisande, about the truth of who we are as Americans and the complete history that we need to move forward. I certainly felt in writing A Question of Freedom that I needed to reckon with this history openly, including the fact that some of my ancestors had enslaved Queen family members at some points, and others had represented the Jesuits against the Queens in the freedom suits. All of this, we've uncovered so much truth. And that day at the public library in New Orleans, you said to me, our ancestors are calling our names.
Yeah.
I think you said they're calling our names. They're calling you, Will. And the last thing you said to me that day, and we've had many conversations since, but I think the last thing you said to me that day was, this is about the truth.
Right. Right. And our country is 246 years old. That's our history. It doesn't go back to Roman history or biblical Egyptian history. Our history is 246 years old. So when we talk about who we are as a people, that is what we are talking about. So it wasn't a long time ago. My grandmother, who was born in 1896, knew her grandmother, who was 16 years old when she was sold in 1838. The youngest person to be sold in 1838 in the Jesuit slave sale was in utero. She died in 1927. So we have created alternative realities in the last 120 years that speaks specifically to the lost cause narrative. Everybody was a happy slave. And this was good. There were no bad guys. So we've created this narrative in our last 100 years that are myths to support white supremacy. And that is not what America is. America is me. I look like America. In me, I have slave holders and the enslaver class, and I have enslaved people because we lived in community as human beings. And yet we have created a system in America that is based on injustices being made appropriate, and that all of the good guys were the white guys and Black people were just automatically enslaved because somebody in Africa sold slaves. That's not who we are. the American internal creation of America's story is uniquely our own, and that we are a country made up of people from all over the world doesn't change that. And if what we have been doing as a nation, as a country, is not sustainable, look at where we are.
We need history, I think. We need to come to terms with history in a way that we haven't. And I think this story of the complicated, intertwined history of these freedom suits gives us a perspective on the founding, on the society of that period, and of the longevity of families. I mean, the Queen family, the Mahoney family, when they sued for freedom, had been in Maryland for 5 generations.
Right. 11. I'm an 11th generation American.
Right. So so I think thinking of this history in family terms helps us. I hope.
I want too about that.
Go ahead.
This is the inheritance of being an American.
Right.
Whether you have been here for 11 generations or you've been here for 1. If you haven't been here for 11 generations and your family made a decision for you to come to America because there was better opportunity for you here than there, once you came to America, this became your inheritance as well as an American. If you are an American, this belongs to us all. It's just not my Black history. This is how we became who we are today. And there are people, there are Black people who have been here since colonialism got here. So we're here now. We can actually do better. And we have to identify and correct. We have identified the wrongs. Can we correct them? Are we willing to actually be the generations that correct what has been wrong? People say, oh, the system is broken. No, it's not. The system is working as it was created. It's not broke.
Let's open it up for questions, and I think both Mélisande and I would be delighted to hear what's on your minds and see where the conversation goes.
Yes, thank you guys both for the wonderful presentation. I see that we do have a question from Constance Old. Did Charles Mahoney represent himself in court?
He did not represent himself in court. I mean, he was in court, but his lawyer was Gabriel Duval. And Gabriel Duval went on to become an associate justice on the United States Supreme Court. In fact, Gabriel Duval gave the only dissent in the Queen v. Hepburn Supreme Court case we've been talking about. So Duval, as a lawyer, was Mahoney's lawyer. And, you know, Duval was a slaveholder. He represented a lot of these families suing for freedom. He did so, I think, for political reasons, and and he eventually issues this dissent in the Queen v. Hepburn case that the right to liberty, the right to freedom is more important than the right to property. And, that is the kind of question of freedom that he called, that American history wrestles with throughout the 19th century. Charles Mahoney did not represent himself in court, but he was there. And the way the freedom suits worked, the slaveholders could not speak for themselves. They could not take the stand in their own defense. So these were civil suits, and slaveholders were being sued individually. And in that period of law in the United States, the defendant in a civil suit could not take the stand in their own defense. So slaveholders couldn't speak before the court. And both parties were speaking through their lawyers only. It's a great question.
So we have another question. It's actually from my mom, Debbie Smith. But she says, given all the recent discussions about taking history books out of the classrooms, how do we continue to have the conversation of the Black history and America's history that encourages people to speak up and speak their truth?
Melisande?
Well, history has been an ongoing problem in America. And history has always been he who holds the pen tells the story. I had an oral history in my family, and I think that is something that we don't talk about enough anymore. Get with your old people. I knew because my grandmother knew. It was the history of a family. So when Will came to me and the Georgetown Memory Project came to me, I had my family history that included this information, but I was not connected to the Jesuits. So I hadn't connected my family in particular with the Jesuit story until it fell on my head. And then I found out that my grandmother wasn't lying. Francis Scott Key was our family's attorney, and we were very famous people, as she liked to say. So I think it is incumbent upon us to understand that school is not the only place where people learn. You learn in your family, you learn in your community, you learn from your parents. They may be banning books in schools, but they're not banning books in libraries. And we have to be proactively involved in education. The reason why we're in Black History Month right now is because Black people always knew we had our own stories and our own histories that weren't a part of the general American story. But as I said earlier, that is no longer sustainable because it is 2022. And we do have access to more information than ever before. So the limitations that are placed on us are external and should not be internalized.
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned about the efforts to try to remove or restrict history. I'm very concerned about these efforts to restrict so-called divisive concepts from the teaching of history. History is an investigation into the past. It's the story of all human history in the past. And to suggest that it should serve patriotic ends or certain other ends is to misunderstand history itself. And so I think educators, myself included, have to stand up for what history is and what its concerns are, what it's concerned with. History is concerned with telling the fullest possible story of the past from the evidence we have in front of us. And that's what I try to do. And I think educators in history in our schools need to be trusted and empowered and supported to do that.
I think that that's true, but not everybody supports the same history.
Mhm.
And as the United States of America, we are a republic of 50 states. And unfortunately, the very notions that are so divisive, actually are the notions that, and the history that we've been pushing along for the last 120 years. And there are always people who push against that as historians, as individuals. But when you have people legislating and making policies to suppress and oppress, that's a whole different story. And we should not talk about that.
Right.
So a question from Ashley is, Dr. Thomas, beyond the National Archives, what other repositories did you go to when conducting your research? And that question kind of falls in line of one of the questions that I have, which is, what was like some of the most challenging aspects of researching and writing your book?
Ashley, thank you. I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned. I think the other big archive I worked in was the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis. And so they had all of the judgment books and the court dockets for the Maryland the Maryland cases, the Maryland courts, Prince George's County and Annapolis. And so the Maryland State Archives was crucial for what I was doing. And I also went to London because Mary Queen's claim was that she had set foot in London and had gone to London on this famous voyage, a voyage undertaken by Captain Woodes Rogers across the South America, and that she had returned with that voyage to England in 1709, 1710, 1711. And so I went to the National Archives in London to track down the records of that voyage. There was a major lawsuit about that voyage. And this was one of the most important archival pieces of the puzzle because there was a Maria, there was a Mary on board that ship that came into London in 1711, and there was evidence there deeply buried in the records of this litigation, a creditor's suit about Mary, and you know I think her story that she tells that makes it into the court record in the cases in Maryland is backed up by much of this evidence in the London archives. And so those were the big ones. But I did also go to Louisiana, as Mélisande knows, and went to the court records in Iberville and Ascension Parish. I wanted to know, had any of the families sold to Louisiana been able somehow, some way, to bring a freedom suit against the Jesuits or against their current slaveholders in Louisiana. And the answer to that question was no, they were not able to. It was miles to the nearest courthouse. There weren't lawyers around. They'd been separated from their family in Maryland. Much of the legal landscape was different. And so, so the separation, the violence of that separation and what it did to the family was clearly evident in the very fact that those freedom suits were shut down and unable to be pursued in Louisiana. What was the second question? I'm sorry.
No worries. My question was, what was the most challenging aspect of researching and writing this book?
Well, I think the most challenging aspect was that we really I didn't have the words of these families like a Charles Mahoney or an Edward Queen. So as a writer, I had to try to use other techniques to bring them alive in the story. And I wanted to write a book that would leave the reader feeling differently about this history. I wanted you to care about this history in a way that you maybe didn't before. And I wanted you to see these people in their full humanity and full dimensionality. And without their words, it's hard. That was hard. I tried to do it in ways that would put them in front of you as you read this, and be able to see what they were doing and what they were, why they might have been acting as they did, and what these suits meant, and what it shows about their families. And that was probably the biggest challenge I think I faced.
We have a question from Rachel Hammer. When I think of land ownership, I think of quite peaceful enjoyment. You said freedom was more important than I think it's supposed to say more important than land ownership. I think this is about fair and just. How can you have a quiet, peaceful enjoyment without freedom of Coventry and self? When did real estate law define ownership of real property as quite peaceful enjoyment before or after slavery?
I think in terms of freedom and land ownership, actually, for the Queens and the Mahonies and others who sued for freedom, they were then able to acquire property, acquire land, and they did in Maryland. And so Michael Queen, who won his freedom in court earlier, started buying land in around what is today Baltimore, around Middle River Station. Others inherited land. I mean, so the pursuit of land ownership and property was an important part of freedom making. It came with all of the efforts that these families undertook to win their freedom. Melisande, did you want to add to that?
I think property ownership at that time was not just land ownership. It was also the ownership of people and plows and chickens. And I know when Charles Mahoney, when John Ashton, when they finally went through the 12 years, John Ashton gave him some land, gave the family another enslaved person, gave them livestock, and all of this after this 12-year court case.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to say earlier, We have 12 Years a Slave. That was a story that has captured American imagination since Solomon Northrop wrote it in the 1850s. And it resurfaced again a few years ago and took the nation by storm. We have 12 years of court case.
Right.
Nobody talks about it.
Right.
Why? What makes an American story, an American history important in the court of popular opinion, in popular culture? And that's what we have. We have a line of story that has been pushed in popular culture and is a consensus history. History by consensus. We have to challenge that.
If I might jump back to Rachel's question, I now see it in the chat, and I realize that I kind of didn't quite hear it correctly, and so I'll just try to clarify one thing. Rachel, you've asked a good question about the quote that of Justice Duvall, that the right to freedom, the right to liberty, is more important than the right to property. The property he's referring to there is not land. The property he's referring to there is enslaved people. And so slaveholders were trying to assert in the law, in the courts, that enslaved people were nothing more and nothing less than property. And under the right to property, slaveholders were protected, and slavery was protected. It could not be eliminated. And so, and in fact, that is what the Dred Scott case holds, that enslaved people are property. And so this earlier period, though, the point is, this was enslaved families were bringing these cases in order to assert their humanity, in order to assert their personhood, in order to say quite clearly that enslaved people are not property. And the logic of it, repeated again and again in every freedom suit, is important to recognize. So just wanted to clarify that the property concept is not really about land. It's about in the idea that slaveholders had that enslaved people were property and should be treated as property under the law. And Duvall was saying, well, wait a minute, we've got a freedom case here about an individual person, and the right to freedom is more important in the law than this right to property idea. When considered, we ought to lean toward the right to freedom. And that's what was happening in the aftermath of the revolution and the aftermath of the 1780s, 1790s. But gradually in American history, slaveholders asserted this other idea that property rights were paramount, and that enslaved people were not persons under the meaning of the law. And so that's the insidious, difficult truth about American history that we need to come to terms with. So, okay, let's see.
We have a
Jasmine,
couple more questions. Yeah. One's from John Meeks. As a lawyer, I'm embarrassed that I haven't heard of this lawyer, Duvall, who was on the U.S. Supreme Court, as he was a slaveholder, but apparently argued in favor or enslaved people. Would he be a good example to use as we try to pry open the dialogue in our schools and elsewhere as we confront the entire heritage of our nation?
Yeah, I mean, I think Duvall is an important part of this story. He is just as conflicted and unable to see the broader freedom of Black Americans as many other white Americans were, including Francis Scott Key and Thomas Jefferson. Duval was a Jefferson protege. He corresponded with Jefferson. He was a Republican. He was one of the first Jeffersonian Republicans in Maryland. He was an active Jeffersonian Republican, and his views sort of align with Jefferson's. Now, Duval was later sued for freedom by people he held in slavery, and he lost that freedom suit. And you know, I think his story is complicated, right? It's the complicated story of American history in this period, and it's why it's useful to talk about him. And so I think your question's a really good one. Is he someone to talk about? Yeah, sure. He's a complicated slaveholder, judge, whose views are challenging, and we need to reckon with them.
And I'd like to say about the suit. The Constitution was ratified in 1789. The first freedom suit was brought in 1791. So we talk about critical race theory in law school. We don't teach freedom suits in law school. You know, most here at Georgetown, it's not where it happened in Maryland, in DC. Nobody knows about it because it is not consensus history. Dred Scott is consensus history. Freedom suits are not. Dred Scott has value in the fashioning of American society from the Civil War to 2022, and the freedom suits of enslaved persons has not. Why?
Yeah, I've had several questions about this, and so I'll just briefly say, several lawyers, lots of lawyers who asked me about this. Why wasn't this taught in law school? You know, and or I didn't realize that the foundation case, one of the most cited cases in American law for the hearsay rule, is Queen v. Hepburn, a case that denied an enslaved woman, an enslaved family, freedom. And as we've just discussed, not only was it her freedom and her daughter Louisa's freedom, but Priscilla Queen and all the other Queen family members held by the Jesuits and all the other people held by the Jesuits were affected, and others in Maryland could no longer make claims really based on this kind of evidence. And so they were subject to, well, as Mélisande, you've as you've told us, to the sale and separation and the tragedy and the violence of history and of slavery. So yes, lawyers are to this day citing the case and citing other cases.
And don't know anything about it.
Well, and to use the lawyer's terminology, it's good law.
It's good law. It was good law then, it's good law now.
So there is a real issue here, and I think scholars and historians and lawyers are trying to work it out. But I hope that in law school, a question of freedom will be taught, or at least brought into discussion. And yeah, so thank you for the question.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Okay.
Faye Anderson asks, as a practical matter, how did the enslaves get time off to attend court hearings?
Well, as a practical matter, the court, slaveholders could not restrict them from their own case. So in these cases, the court also issued essentially a ruling, and this was routine, that the person not be taken out of the district of the court, away from the court, right? So this was one of the most important aspects of filing a freedom suit, because if someone were about to be sold, if their children were about to be sold, then a freedom suit might at least delay or interrupt or keep the people from being taken outside of the jurisdiction of the court. And it is also the case that some slaveholders knew about this. If they caught wind of a freedom suit, they would try to sell the person away right away. And so that happened in numerous instances. And the kind of reprisal and punishment that could come from filing a freedom suit, there were serious risks. But for the enslaved families, suing at the right moment, at the right time, was part of what was happening. And I really tried to pay attention to the timing of these freedom suits in individual cases.
And I think too, at some point, freedom suits and the ability for enslaved people in formerly British colonies, in French and Spanish colonies, there were always mechanisms there, especially during the colonial period. But then when America came to be and the internal slave trade fashioned itself after 1808, it became incumbent upon the law and policy to oppress Black people's notions and ideas about freedom. And so the movement from the upper South, Virginia and Maryland, to the lower deep South of Georgia and Louisiana, to go to cane fields and to cut trees and plant cotton fields. Those were situations where freedom was not optional. The only way you were going to be free was to run for your life, and we're coming after you.
We have one question from Michelle Flamer, and then I have a question of my own, and then I think that will be it for the time that we have allotted today. Michelle asks, any comment on the 2021 Blue Book rule change that identifies enslaved parties as enslaved in footnotes now in reported cases?
Sure, I'll comment on that. This is part of the work of a scholar at Michigan State University, Justin Simard, who published a piece a year ago called "Citing Slavery" in the Stanford Law Review. I'm in favor of it. I think bringing to light the connections to slavery and the law is a valuable reckoning and an important change. But I'm not a practicing lawyer, and I don't know how it impacts how lawyers do their work exactly. But as a historian, I think all we can do to identify and acknowledge the complicated history behind some of the things that we take for granted, is really valuable. Librarians, for example, are undertaking similar work in the way libraries catalog, in the way libraries put metadata together to make material accessible or to categorize certain domains of knowledge. I think these conversations are valuable, and I think they're important for us to have. And these kinds of changes make a difference in our world.
And then the last question I have is, what advice can you offer to others who are grappling with the legacies of slavery, especially around the issue of reparations?
Well, for me, slavery, enslavement of human beings, and the building of the system of the American chattel slavery system was always about money. It was created for money, for economics, to have an unpaid labor force that in fact laid the foundation for the America we have today. Have there been things that happened along the way? Yes, there have been. But if we take enslavement and the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of people for multiple generations in this place out of the equation, what would America be today in 246 years?
I would add that I think repairing this history is going to take many forms. It's going to take many pathways. And I think we have to be open to where we can repair, where we can restore relationships, where we can acknowledge the full history of our country. That's at the core of this, is that acknowledgement and restoration of relationships. And the larger political arguments and questions about reparations are important. They're very important to have. And I think we need to be open to a variety of ways that reparation will come. We need spiritual reparation. We need a variety of forms of reparation. And so I hope that we will be open and move forward, not out of shame or guilt or any other unproductive emotional feeling, but out of a sense of justice and a sense of restoration and a sense of the humanity and of repairing what's been broken in our history.
I would say too that this is our collective inheritance here as Americans. If we don't do the work of repairing, or not even repairing, of stepping into truth about who we are and being able to be truthful and not be ashamed. I'm not ashamed of having had enslaved ancestors. I am here. I have work to do. The people who are descendants of enslavers, don't be ashamed. Do your work.
Right.
And if you do not believe that that is how we are supposed to be, and that is not who you are, step out and say that, because none of us will flourish in a country where white supremacy is allowed to flourish. Not anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great end to this wonderful lecture that you guys provided with us. Thank you again, Dr. Thomas and Melisande, for your research and getting us through tonight's event.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.